Who added this condition? The Veliner minister asked, tapping the page with a single finger. No one answered. The room was sealed, soundproofed, and deliberately windowless, but everyone inside seemed to feel the weight of the world pressing in. Carithes' delegation sat rigid on one side of the table, their folders thin, their posture rehearsed. Across from them, Veliner's officials leaned back in their chairs, confident, almost bored. Read it again, an advisor murmured. The chief negotiator cleared his throat. Clause 7, he said, slower this time. All future compliance reviews shall be conducted jointly, with equal procedural authority granted to both parties. A pause. That's not what we discussed, someone from Veliner said quietly. Andrew Hale stood behind Carithes' lead delegate, hands folded, eyes fixed on the document. He said nothing. He wasn't supposed to speak. He wasn't supposed to matter. Whispers broke out along the Veliner side of the table. That shifts oversight entirely. It limits enforcement. It sets a precedent. Outside the room, press teams were already drafting statements announcing Carithes' surrender. Cameras were positioned. Analysts were waiting for confirmation that the small nation had finally yielded. The minister looked up again, this time directly at Carithes' delegation. If we accept this, she said, we give up unilateral control. Carithes' lead delegate hesitated, then glanced back. Andrew met the minister's gaze. That's the condition, Andrew said evenly. Silence fell. The minister closed the folder. Does anyone object to this language? No one spoke. If the sentence remained, the truce would hold, and the balance of power would quietly change. If it was challenged, the talks would end right here. Andrew Hale learned early that the safest place in any negotiation was just outside the circle of power. In Carithes' foreign ministry, that place was the narrow desk at the back of Conference Room C, where junior advisors were expected to listen, type, and never interrupt. Andrew had occupied versions of that seat for 3 years, drafting summaries no one signed, clarifying language no one credited, and watching decisions form long before they were officially made. Keep it neutral, his supervisor, Marta Ionescu, reminded him every morning. We're here to document, not influence. Andrew nodded, as always. The truce talks with Veliner were announced as a breakthrough, but inside the ministry, no one believed that. Carithes was smaller, economically strained, and diplomatically isolated. Veliner was patient, powerful, and in no hurry. The talks weren't meant to resolve anything. They were meant to end cleanly, with Carithes taking the blame. Andrew saw it in the first draft. Language of acknowledgement. One senior official called it during a preparatory meeting. Nothing accusatory, just factual. Andrew scrolled through the document, his jaw tightening. Acknowledges responsibility for prior escalations, it read. Commits to corrective concessions pending verification. He raised his hand halfway, then stopped. Across the table, Deputy Minister Ralden was already speaking. This gives Veliner room to claim moral victory without binding themselves to action. That's acceptable. Acceptable to whom? Andrew wondered. The delegations arrived at the neutral venue 3 weeks later, a converted diplomatic complex on an island state that prided itself on discretion. Andrew watched from the side as Carithes' team filed in, their luggage modest, their expressions carefully composed. Veliner's arrival was louder. More staff, more aides, a longer motorcade. Symbolism matters, Ralden said quietly as they took their seats. We look cooperative. They look generous. Andrew opened his laptop and began typing. The opening sessions were exactly as predicted. Polite statements. Carefully timed concessions that meant nothing. Every clause was framed to sound mutual while placing the burden on Carithes. During a break, Andrew leaned toward Marta. Clause 4 contradicts Clause 2, he whispered. If enforcement is unilateral, then joint review is meaningless. Marta didn't look at him. Noted, she said softly, but not relevant. By the third day, the drafts grew more precise and more dangerous. Veliner's legal team began inserting phrases that appeared harmless but shifted responsibility subtly, in recognition of prior actions, in the interest of restoring balance. Each line nudged Carithes closer to an implicit admission. Andrew highlighted sections, adding comments no one addressed. That evening, he overheard a conversation he wasn't meant to hear. These talks will fail, a Veliner advisor said casually in the corridor. But not because of us. Ralden smiled thinly. Of course. Andrew returned to his room with a knot in his chest. He reopened the latest draft, reading it slowly, without the language of diplomacy softening its meaning. If signed as written, Corythes would lose oversight, credibility, and leverage, all while appearing to agree voluntarily. He typed a note to himself. This isn't negotiation. It's choreography. The next morning, during a closed-door review, Andrew finally spoke, just once. There's an inconsistency in how responsibility is framed, he said, keeping his voice measured. If both parties are committed to de-escalation, the language should reflect shared process. The room went quiet. Ralden glanced at him, surprised. We'll consider it, he said after a beat. They didn't. By the end of the session, Andrew understood the truth fully. The agreement wasn't flawed by accident. It was engineered to collapse after Corythes signed, leaving Valiner free to dictate the narrative. That night, Andrew sat alone in the document archive, the glow of his screen reflecting off untouched coffee. For the first time, he asked himself a dangerous question. If everyone expects failure, what happens if someone changes the script? Have you ever stayed quiet at work when you knew something important was wrong? What would you have done? Andrew waited until the building went quiet. The archive wing emptied first, then the legal offices. By midnight, the only sound left in the diplomatic complex was the low hum of climate control and the distant surf breaking against the island's rocks. He sat alone at the long table, the final draft of the truce agreement open on his screen, its margins clean, its language deceptively calm. He scrolled to Article 7. The sentence was still there. In recognition of prior actions contributing to regional instability, Corythes affirms its responsibility to initiate corrective measures. Andrew leaned back and rubbed his eyes. Affirms its responsibility, he murmured. Initiate. To Valiner, the phrase meant admission. To Corythes' leadership, it had been pitched as procedural courtesy. Both sides believed they understood it. Neither interpretation could coexist. He opened the version history and traced how the sentence had evolved. Earlier drafts had said both parties acknowledge. That had been removed in a late session, replaced quietly, almost politely. No one had flagged it. No one had objected. Because no one was supposed to. Andrew checked the corridor again, then unlocked the comparative analysis tool. He split the screen. Valiner's preferred legal interpretation on one side, Corythes' internal briefing notes on the other. The contradiction was no longer subtle. It was structural. If this stands, he said softly to the empty room, we concede before we speak. His phone buzzed. A message from Marta. Still awake? He hesitated, then typed back. Reviewing Article 7. The response came a minute later. Don't overthink it. We're past revisions. Past revisions. Past agency. Andrew stared at the sentence again, his cursor blinking at the end like a metronome counting down. Protocol was clear. Junior advisors did not amend negotiated text without authorization. Unauthorized changes were career-ending, sometimes worse. Even suggesting an edit at this stage could be read as insubordination. He imagined the morning session. The cameras. Ralden reading aloud. Valiner's delegates nodding solemnly while the press drafted their narrative. He imagined Corythes signing. Andrew highlighted the sentence. What if, he said quietly, responsibility isn't the word. He began typing in a private draft. In recognition of prior actions affecting regional stability, both parties commit to initiating corrective measures through a jointly defined process. He stopped. The change was small, almost invisible, but it did three things at once. It removed unilateral admission. It reframed action as mutual. And it forced Valiner into process instead of posture. Andrew read it again, slower this time. To Corythes, it preserved dignity. To Valiner, it still sounded like leadership. To the agreement, it meant survival. He deleted the private draft and opened the official document. His hands hovered over the keyboard. This is the part where you close the file, he told himself. You let it fail. You keep your job. The room felt smaller. Hotter. He thought of the corridor conversation. These talks will fail, but not because of us. He thought of Ralden's thin smile. Andrew made the edit. One sentence. 12 words changed. No track comments. No annotations. He saved the file, heart pounding, then froze as footsteps echoed faintly outside. He minimized the screen, breath held, until the sound passed. He exhaled shakily and reopened the document. The sentence sat there, unremarkable, integrated, impossible to isolate without comparison. Andrew checked the metadata. Timestamp, 12:47 a.m. Editor, system account. He'd used the shared terminal, the same one dozens of staff access daily. Plausible. Barely. He uploaded the revised draft to the secure circulation folder and flagged it as consolidated for morning review. The same phrasing used every night. For a long moment, he stared at the confirmation message. File successfully distributed. There was no alarm. No knock at the door. No message demanding explanation. Just silence. Andrew shut down the terminal and gathered his things. In the hallway, the lights dimmed automatically as he walked, as if the building itself were trying not to notice what had changed. Back in his room, he lay on the bed fully dressed, staring at the ceiling. By morning, the document would be official. By afternoon, it would be read aloud. And by then, there would be no way to admit what he'd done, only to see whether anyone else noticed. If you were in his position, would you risk your career to change one sentence? Why or why not? The room felt different the moment the delegates sat down. Andrew noticed it before anyone spoke. Chairs scraped more carefully against the floor. Folders opened slower. Even the air conditioning seemed quieter, as if the building itself were listening. Ralden, Carithes' chief delegate, adjusted his glasses and nodded to the Veliner side. Shall we proceed with the consolidated draft? The Veliner minister didn't answer immediately. She was still reading. Her advisor leaned in. Clause 7, he whispered. I see it, she replied, eyes narrowing, not in anger, but calculation. Ralden began to read aloud, his voice steady. In recognition of prior actions affecting regional stability, both parties commit to initiating corrective measures through a jointly defined process. Pause, the minister said. Every pen stopped moving. Andrew kept his gaze on the table, pulse hammering. That phrasing, she continued, tapping the page, is different. Ralden looked genuinely surprised. Is it? Her advisor spoke carefully. It implies shared procedural authority. Yes, Ralden said, after a fraction of a second. That was the intention. A murmur rippled through the Veliner delegation. That limits our enforcement mechanisms. It also limits their exposure, another advisor added. The minister leaned back, steepling her fingers. You're asking us to trade control for cooperation. Ralden met her gaze. We're asking you to trade certainty for stability. Silence stretched. Andrew felt the tension move. Not spike, but bend. This wasn't confrontation. It was reassessment. Outside the room, Andrew knew, analysts were already sharpening their language. Carithes yields. Veliner dictates terms. The narrative was written, just not yet published. The minister closed her folder halfway. If we accept this wording, she said, we set a precedent. Ralden nodded. So do we. She glanced down the table, exchanging looks with her advisors. No one seemed eager to object outright. The sentence didn't attack. It didn't accuse. It didn't even demand. It invited. We'll need to reframe our position, the minister said quietly. Ralden smiled faintly. So will we. As the discussion moved forward, Andrew watched the subtle shifts. Arguments softened. Absolutes became conditions. Phrases like non-negotiable quietly disappeared, replaced by subject to review and mutual agreement. During a break, two Veliner advisors stepped into the corridor. This gives them room, one said. It gives us cover, the other replied. We can sell this as restraint. Andrew stood a few steps away, pretending to check his phone. Back inside, the minister leaned toward Ralden. You understand, she said, that this won't be framed as concession. Ralden inclined his head. Of course. And Carithes won't present it as vindication. Also understood. They shared a look, not warm, but respectful. The look of two people who realized the table had shifted beneath them and decided to stand instead of flip it. By mid-afternoon, the word collapse was no longer whispered. A scheduling aide entered quietly and placed a note beside the minister. She read it, then nodded once. The final session will proceed as planned, she announced. Andrew exhaled, the breath leaving him before he realized he'd been holding it. No one looked at him. No one thanked him. No one accused him. As the delegation stood, the minister paused near Andrew's position. For a moment, he thought she might speak. Instead, she said softly, to no one in particular, language matters. Then she walked out. Andrew remained where he was, hands clasped, heart still racing. The talks hadn't ended. They hadn't exploded. They had realigned. A future had opened, not clean, not certain, but possible. And it had happened without a speech, without a vote, without a name attached. If stories about unseen decisions and quiet influence matter to you, subscribe, because these moments shape more than we realize. The final session began without ceremony. No cameras, no speeches, just a long table, a stack of papers, and the quiet awareness that whatever happened in the next hour would outlive everyone in the room. Ralden cleared his throat. We'll proceed with the final reading. Across from him, the Veliner minister nodded once. Go ahead. Andrew sat 2 seats back, hands folded, eyes fixed on the margin of the document where the revised sentence lived. Unremarkable, almost invisible now. It no longer looked dangerous. That, he realized, was the point. Ralden read steadily. Clause after clause passed without interruption. Familiar language. Carefully balanced commitments. Mutually agreed frameworks. Each paragraph landed softly, like a stone placed rather than thrown. Then he reached it. Clause 7, Ralden said, his voice unchanged. In recognition of prior actions affecting regional stability, both parties commit to initiating corrective measures through a jointly defined process. Subject to mutual review. The Veliner minister finished quietly. Ralden looked up. Correct. No one spoke. Andrew felt his chest tighten. This was the moment. If anyone challenged it, if a legal advisor raised a hand, if a senior delegate asked for clarification, the fragile alignment could fracture. The minister scanned her side of the table. Any objections? A Veliner advisor shifted in his chair, opened his mouth, closed it again. Another shook her head slightly. Ralden mirrored the gesture on his side. Carithes raises none. The minister nodded. Then proceed. The sentence stayed. The agreement continued. When the final clause was read, there was no applause. Just the soft sound of pages closing. It appears, the minister said, standing, that we have an understanding. Ralden rose as well. It appears so. They shook hands, not for the cameras, not even firmly. It was brief, almost procedural, but it was enough. Outside the room, press officers were already preparing statements. Constructive dialogue, one murmured. Framework for cooperation, another suggested. No reference to concessions, the minister said as she passed. Emphasize restraint. Stability, her advisor replied. That word tests well. Across the corridor, a Carithes official was giving similar instructions. Balanced outcome. Mutual responsibility. Forward-looking. Andrew watched it happen, the story forming without him. Later, in a smaller anteroom, Ralden stopped him. For the record, Ralden said quietly, your analysis was helpful. Andrew blinked. I was just doing the review. Ralden smiled faintly. Yes, exactly. The Veliner minister appeared at the doorway, coat already on. She glanced at Andrew, then at Ralden. Your team understands, she said, that this only works if neither side claims authorship. Ralden inclined his head. Of course. She looked back at Andrew. For a moment, it seemed she might say more. Instead, she said, some sentences are better without signatures. Then she left. The room emptied quickly after that. Chairs pushed in. Documents gathered. A process concluded. Andrew packed his notes last. As he stepped into the hallway, the building felt different again, not tense now, but lighter. Somewhere above him, flags were being adjusted for a joint photo. Somewhere outside, analysts would soon declare winners and losers. None of them would mention the sentence. None of them would mention him. Andrew paused at the exit, watching the delegations depart in opposite directions, no longer mirrored by hostility, but by caution and possibility. He felt no urge to correct the record. History, he understood, didn't reward precision. It rewarded outcomes. And this one, fragile, incomplete, real, would hold. He walked out into the evening unnoticed, carrying nothing with him but the quiet knowledge that the world had tilted slightly away from collapse. Should the person who made this possible remain invisible or deserve recognition? Share your judgment.